Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Bob Goodwin, and welcome to another episode of Career Club's LinkedIn Live. If you're not familiar with Career Club, you're welcome to check us out at career.club, where we're using proven sales methods and tools to help folks find a career that matters to them. If you're not following us on LinkedIn, please do. Again, you can follow Career Club, and I'd really love it if you connected with me as well. We're producing content pretty regularly here on LinkedIn beyond these live events, and would love to make sure that you're in the loop as we push content out. This is a live session, so if you're joining us live today, you are welcome, and we would encourage you to ask questions, put comments in. This is a fairly well-registered event, and so may not be able to get to all the questions or comments. And if we don't get to yours, I'll apologize on the front end. But we've got a pretty robust discussion set up for today, which I'm excited about. I also want to say thank you to my colleague, Heather Zinzer, who is the magic behind the scenes here, making all this happen. So Heather, as always, thank you. And so moving on to today's topic, I am over the moon to have Professor Joe Fuller from Harvard Business School on with us today. So Heather, if we could get Joe introduced here. Joe's a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School and the faculty co-chair of the Managing the Future of Work project. And so Joe, welcome today.
Thank you, Bob. Delighted to be with you.
No, we're just really thrilled to have you. I was telling you in the green room, you know, your expertise and obviously the prestige of Harvard means quite a bit. And I know our audience is going to get a lot out of our conversation. But before we dive into the topic, one of our little traditions here, such as we have traditions, is just a little bit of an icebreaker so folks can get to know you a little bit better. So just a couple minutes on, first of all, just where were you born and raised? Where'd you grow up?
Well, it hasn't been a very long journey. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my parents were both Harvard professors.
Oh,
So
my
I'm back
goodness.
in the family business.
Oh, awesome. So have you always been in the Boston area?
Yes, pretty much. My dad left Harvard Business School, where he was a tenured professor in the early 1970s, to become the chief human resources officer at General Motors in Detroit. So I went to high school in Detroit, and at least one good thing happened to me there, which is I met my wife.
Well, that leads to another question. So just a little bit about your family.
Well, I'm happily married now for close. It'll be 39 years in July. Oddly, my wife never remembers our anniversary. Have 3 times in those 39 years she's remembered it. And we have 3 sons, 2 in Boston and 1 in Chicago, and 2 grandsons in Chicago. And today is the birthday of my youngest son and my oldest grandson.
Awesome.
They're a father and son combination who were born on the same day.
Now that's pretty cool. Well, happy birthday to them both.
Thank you.
And then would love it if just sort of briefly you could share with the audience a little bit about your career arc and what's led you to your current role.
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up around Harvard and Harvard Business School, and I went to college at Harvard. And then, in what was unusual for the time, I was accepted directly into the business school. And throughout that whole period, when I was a student at Harvard, I was the research assistant for a young assistant professor, and we worked together quite a lot, along with my older brother, Mark. And that assistant professor is Mike Porter, the famous business strategist. I met him in his second year as assistant professor when I was a freshman at college, looking for an opportunity to make some additional money on the side. And he and I and my brother and several other people started a consulting firm pretty much as soon as I left business school, called Monitor. I was the head of the commercial consulting operations there for about 30 years, and then stepped down from running the business in '06, and eventually joined the Harvard Business School faculty in 2011. Monitor was bought by Deloitte in 2012. And is now called Monitor Deloitte, and happily continues to prosper and grow under the, I think, quite good stewardship of Deloitte. So I must admit,
Mm.
when the business was sold, I had trepidation going and becoming a part of a really ginormous firm like Deloitte, but they've done a magnificent job uh, growing the practice and making it integral to what they do. Kept the brand through the modular Deloitte logo, and very pleased to how
Mm.
it all turned out.
No, that's spectacular. Well, Michael Porter, wow, that's kind of hard to do better than that. That's amazing.
Well, he's. I think he was an usher in my wedding, and I went to his, which was a very small service, and we've spent a lot of time together, and it was a great privilege getting to shape some of that work and to build a business together
Mm,
with Mike and a few of our other founders. That firm got to a couple of thousand people, so it became a
goodness, yeah.
substantial enterprise.
Quite familiar with Monitor. So, um, just very briefly, where do we find you when you're not thinking about the future of work? What are you doing? What do you like to do outside of work stuff?
Well, I will confess to being a fairly avid Boston sports fan, so a little bit nervous about Thursday night, but I'll be at the Celtics game on Thursday night, hoping they
Nice.
can extend the series. And the I read a lot of nonfiction. We have a place out in the Berkshires in the western part of
Mhm.
Massachusetts, which is a very peaceful spot. We also have two large bird dogs, a standard pointer and a Bracco Italiano, which is a rare breed in the United States. And it's an Italian pointer, and Braccos are described in the writings of people like Livy and Cicero. So they've been around for a while.
Goodness.
She's a COVID puppy. That breed is
Yes.
notoriously stubborn when they get to be adults. They have a high prey drive, it's called. I'm not a hunter, but I've always liked gun dogs. So I always wanted a Bronco, but never dared get one because of the training burden was so
Hmm.
great. But suddenly we were all grounded. So I was able to get a Bronco puppy, and her name is Calypso. She's turned out to be a great dog. So we enjoy taking her for hikes um, and being out in the countryside as well.
Very fun. Well, that's awesome. So, getting on to our topic, if you could just share with the audience a little bit about the project that you're helping co-lead at Harvard on the future of work, and sort of what's the mandate? Maybe that's a good place to start.
Well, one of the good things about being a professor and also the way I've been treated by Harvard since I joined the faculty about 10 years ago is that they do allow you to exercise a lot of discretion. And this project started, Bob, as a subset of a broader project on the US economy.
Mm,
And that was ongoing when I joined the faculty because it had been started right after the Great Recession.
mm,
And we had done some polling of our alumni specifically to isolate factors about US competitiveness which they felt were both important to American competitiveness and where that the level of performance of the US economy was changing. So,
mm,
for example, in areas like IP creation, very important to the US economy and improving. But one data point jumped out at me, which is the labor force was adjudged as being highly important to American competitiveness and declining relative to peer competitors at a pretty rapid rate, according to our survey work. So that caught my attention, and I also was interested that no faculty member had taken that on. And when I asked around, it was just that no one really felt that there was a single faculty member who had relevant expertise. So I decided to dive in
mm,
and very rapidly um, uh, found that there were a number of anomalies in the way people understood the labor market and understood the role of human assets in our current economy. Most of the research being done started with the supply side or the characteristics of workers, how are they
mm,
changing, what outcomes are they getting, and the demand side employers were viewed almost as a plug variable at the end of the equation. There wasn't an understanding of how employers view this problem, the issues involved. how they strategized and thought about talent through the lens of risk management. So I decided to dive in. Pretty quickly, the research we were doing on workforce became more than half of the work being done by the larger project. So our dean at the time, Dean Nithin Noria, suggested that we split it out. And at that time, a co-head, Professor Bill Kerr, my colleague and friend who's a scholar of skilled immigration and immigration entrepreneurship,
Mm.
came on board as my co-head. I maybe this is going to sound like a typical Harvard conceit, Bob, but really what we wanted to do was view the problem through the lens of what does a business decision maker and a political decision maker, political executive, really need to understand as they confront choices or challenges about workforce. So we've looked at the skills gap, we've looked at hiring credentials and how artificial intelligence
Mm.
affects the scope of candidates that are considered and distorts outcomes. We've looked at caregiving and the role of caregiving obligations on people's productivity and career paths. We've looked at low wage workers and what are the mechanisms by which they can get out of low wage trap jobs. We're publishing a major paper in November on the relationship between businesses and community colleges. So it's been a pretty broad ambit. Um, we've also tried to disseminate the message by creating papers that are user friendly. They're not scholarly per se. No Greek letters. No obscure algorithms. Just a common sense approach with a lot of original primary research, survey work of employers, workers, and skills providers who are generally educational institutions. We've also have a podcast series. So we have over 200 podcasts that are posted that focus on different thought leaders, both in business and not-for-profits
Mhm.
and political figures. So really trying to create a platform where practical solutions get raised and discussed and powered by new data.
Yeah. And so if you thought about at the end, well, I don't know if this project would ever have an end because the topic doesn't have an end. But what are some KPI success factors, things that you guys would, ideally like to see as outcomes of the project?
Well, the first is that we're not just participating in a dialogue, but the dialogue is changing. And what I find consistently is that whether it's CEOs or CHROs or governors or mayors, um, they are confronting pretty tough choices, but they don't always really understand their own economics. They make decisions that are quite rational and defensible based on their understanding of what's going on, but it's their understanding is incomplete. Let
Yeah.
me illustrate that for you. Um, so, for example, a number of years ago, I did the first major piece of research done in the United States about the growth of degree requirements in
Yeah.
job positions. And that it showed that it was a growing trend, that it really started taking off around 2010, and that a large number of jobs had added degree requirements that hadn't previously had a degree requirement for a BA or a BS degree. And um, kind of most astonishingly, sometimes in some positions, 70, 80% of the job postings would require a degree requirement, would require degree attainment, even though only 30% of the incumbent people in the jobs had degrees.
Mm.
We also showed that in jobs that had blended populations of workers, college degree holders, and knowledge non-college degree holders, that the productivity and effectiveness of non-college degree workers who had experience was essentially a push, with college degree holders. But the college degree holders expected to make more, expected to be promoted faster, were more likely to have high turnover in the job.
Mhm.
So that actually the degree requirement begat some economic consequences in the in seeking a gain. But in fact, employers didn't understand their own economics. They weren't getting a gain, but they were getting a uh, worker who was less engaged in their work, wanted to make more money, and more likely to leave in that college graduate. Um, that eventually led to discussion amongst a lot of companies about, well, why do we have a college degree requirement? And a number of companies ended up removing it, as did elements of the federal government. The Trump administration, you may have noticed in the paper that Maryland has just removed it for most jobs in the state government of Maryland. Now, obviously, you have to have a degree if you're going to be an anesthesiologist or
Right.
you're going to be probably if you're going to be a CPA. But for a sales manager, a warehouse manager, a coder, it isn't immediately apparent about why that's required. So trying to doing very clear original research that speaks to a question that executives can make a choice about.
Yeah.
And
So if you don't mind, I would like to kind of go down this trail for half a second, just
sure,
sort of build on it for a minute. You know, from previous conversations, I've got a lot of passion around organizations like Perschool, it's 110 Opportunity at Work, and others that are sort of not only preaching the gospel of is a 4-year degree really required for some pretty good jobs. I mean, these are tech jobs that are, air quote, future proof. They're certainly putting people on a path towards, continued growth and development in their careers. From the employer side, what do you find are the major misconceptions? Because you said earlier, employers are sometimes operating with an incomplete fact set. But what do you find are the objections, the lack of information? What's holding employers back from being more receptive to expanding the talent pool?
well, it's a couple of things. The first is that companies have processes for seeking and retaining talent that are very, very um, well established. I think my dad, who was CHRO of GM, as I mentioned, he would essentially understand GM's approach to recruiting in 2018 or 2019. And it would be very familiar to him what they did and how they did it. Technology's begun to change that, and there have been some dramatic improvements in the last 4 or 5 years, which is why I picked a year like 2018 to point to. But companies are not very good at re-engineering processes. They're hardwired into the system, and changing them is hard. I think that the second is that some of the types of uh, challenges we're seeing for employers on the labor market today have been latent in the job market, growing in importance, but have really popped. Um, like COVID just accelerated digitalization probably by a decade. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden now you need digital natives up and down a lot of your processes. There's a supply demand imbalance. Diversity and inclusion. I've never seen a more sincere and extensive commitment on corporate leaders' parts to make progress in that. But you can't just flip a switch and find highly skill rich diverse talent in most geographies. Everyone's competing for the same talent, and it's hard for companies that don't have a record, let's say, at recruiting at um, uh, historically black colleges and universities, so-called HBCUs,
Mhm.
or don't have a diverse middle and upper management to attract top tier diverse talent. People want to go to companies where people who look like them are visible across the organization. So I think it's change is coming. You mentioned great projects like 110, Opportunity to Work, that's taken my degree uh, research. even further. And there are lots of reason to be optimistic given some of the entrepreneurship and dynamism in the space, but it's still going to be a bit of a long haul.
Yeah. Going back to the point you were making relatedly to the economics and maybe, employers don't understand the economics. One of the things that you were sharing with me was, that employers really do have a poor understanding of the economics and where they're trying to reduce the cost of hire at the great expense of turnover, lack of training. Could you maybe expand on that
Yeah.
topic, please?
Well, we published a couple of papers last year, one this year, one in Labor Day last year, about lower skilled workers. And what you see, Bob, is that there are a number of jobs that we think of as kind of poverty trap jobs, and they're very often in careers or jobs that have very high levels of turnover. And we looked at that, and it turns out there's a bit of a vicious cycle. uh, a job that turns over at a high rate, by definition, has got to be pretty low skilled. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, because a newcomer's got to be able to come in and do it. So if you've got a job like retail clerk, which in many years has a turnover rate of 80-90% nationally, it cannot have lots of technology requirements and lots of experiential requirements simply because candidates don't show up for an entry level retail job. And they have to enter a position where they have a plausible chance of meeting the employer's needs quickly.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? If it's pretty simple, it's low productivity. It's low productivity, it's low wage. If it's high turnover as an employer, prima facie, it doesn't make sense for me to invest in a lot of upskilling because I know that historically people turn over at a high rate. So I'm training them up and then they're going to turn over, and maybe someone else benefits from the training I invested in, but I don't. So I'm not going to train. But it turns out that that isn't some for God ordained outcome. There's no, I've read the Bible. I don't see any 11th commandment that says the following careers, shall be high turnover. In fact, the high turnover is a function of the fact that the jobs are low wage and there isn't any upward mobility. So if you're a low wage worker and you can make 25 cents or 50 cents more an hour, 3 bus stops closer to your house, or in a marginally nicer setting, why wouldn't you? If the employer is not paying you a wage that you find satisfactory, and you have no reasonable expectation of growing your career in that company through being trained, through being upskilled. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another quick example is when we surveyed companies about how frequently caregiving concerns affected the productivity of their workers. The number that on average about 20-25% of companies said, yeah, I think that could be a concern. That could be impacting my productivity. Well, that's funny because 80% of workers said it affected their productivity. And the workers who were affected the most by caregiving obligations were top quartile in terms of pay and title. So your most productive and expensive, most strategically important workers are the most affected by caregiving. But 75%, 80% of companies said, not a concern in my workplace. So right questions aren't being asked, right data isn't being captured, right decisions not being made because of the lack of that insight. You'd start changing the way you thought about benefits if you understood that caregiving was causing people to leave their jobs. And in that top quartile, almost 50% of workers said they'd left at least one job already in their career because they couldn't reconcile their caregiving obligations with the requirements of work.
Wow. Wow. And my daughter had to go home early, literally yesterday, to go take care of her daughter because she got a phone call from daycare, and she felt a ton of tension about, oh my gosh, I've got to leave. I should be leaving right now,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have a choice. And,
Exactly.
and that it feels like a false dichotomy that you have to be stuck in the middle of those two things. A comment and then another question. Last week, the comment is around the upskilling. So last week we had Steve Cadigan on, who was the first CHRO at LinkedIn and has written a great book called Workquake. And he cites a statistic from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, on millennials. So not just low-wage workers necessarily, but even with degrees. The average turnover is 2.8 years. So people aren't staying at GM for 40 years and getting the gold watch. They're turning over pretty quickly. And I think you've even got research on this as well, that the main reason, I don't think it's plurality, I think it's a majority reason, is I'm not growing. Like, they're not investing in me. I don't see myself growing and being developed. Therefore, I'm going to go to a place where I do think that that's more the case. So, and then whether it's these, kind of hourly workers or salaried workers, it's the same dynamic of, well, I'm going to leave because you're not really giving me a compelling reason to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, we never said money. It's like I'm trying to develop my skill set in this new work environment. And just as a human being, I want to be engaged and grow. That's the comment. The question is the disconnect between what's really happening with workers on the front line and in the middle versus what executives believe are the most important things and what they believe are happening, and how policies and programs, are kind of at work or at play in that.
Well, I think the what we see pretty consistently is that decision makers and companies have attributions to their workforce or to candidates to work there, which aren't really rooted in data, and that causes them to make decisions that work against their own best interest. So, for example, we looked at, for lower wage workers, 60 different what we call touch points in the pre-employment, employment, and leaving employment domains. A touch point might be a performance review. And we isolated several factors that really correlated to lower wage workers getting out of those low wage trap jobs, getting earnings levels above 200% of the poverty line in their location. And what we found is there were four very commonsensical touch points that had disproportionate impact on those people who did punch their way out of that corner. They had a mentor or a supervisor that cared about them. They got clear and actionable feedback. What they had to do to get advanced was clear and communicated to them, and there was a way the company helped them access those things they needed to do to get advanced. We asked C-suite executives, middle managers, and frontline supervisors how well their company did on those four dimensions. The C-suite gave themselves A's, the middle managers gave themselves C's, and the frontline supervisors' scores were almost identical to the people they supervised, and they were not honors grades, let's put it that way. Big step down at each level in the organization. So I think CEOs and CHROs would absolutely pass a lie detector test. Are you providing clear and actionable feedback? Do you have opportunities for people to upskill and get advanced? Are your supervisors taught to be mentors and to try to be stewards of the careers of their subordinates? And they'd say that because they've got a binder.
Yeah.
And it says right in the binder, this is what you're supposed to do. And and we've got posters in the lunchroom. And I'm not trying to belittle these efforts. They're very sincere, but they just don't get acted upon in the workplace with anything like the frequency and effectiveness that the C-suite believes they do.
Yeah. So I just wanted one other little quick comment, because we were talking about childcare or those kinds of issues. The other big one that I know that you're pretty dialed into is transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a completely other topic, but just to put it out there for folks who are listening, the ability to get from point A to point B, and to get from, whether it's public transportation or private vehicle, and my car broke down and I've got a crap job that doesn't pay very well. Now I can't afford to get my car fixed. And all of a sudden you're down into a pretty negative spiral pretty
Yes.
quickly. So just to put that out there. Flipping the equation here a little bit, Joe, because we've been talking a lot from the employer's side of the lens. Um, I'd like to start kind of maybe addressing it from the employee's side of the equation. And maybe we could start off with how technology is impacting positively or negatively employees who are seeking to kind of capitalize on the future of work.
Yep. Well, technology, it's kind of an interesting cycle to think about, Bob. Technology is penetrating more and more areas of work, and it's beginning to penetrate areas in white collar, what we call cognitive jobs, in ways that we've never seen before. So technology is going to start intruding, more beyond the paint room in an auto plant or the assembly line for a computer or a smartphone, get more into those white collar domains. Workers are often a bit unsettled by that, particularly middle-aged and older workers
Yeah.
are intimidated sometimes, this is going to be a big impediment to upskilling incumbent workers. When you talk to employed people about upskilling, they often, what they hear is, we're going to send you back to school. And a whole lot of people in the workforce didn't think school was all that great, maybe aren't that confident in some of their basic skills, a little, think that sending you back to school is so you can get graded and maybe graded out, flunk out. Um, the technology, however, is unable to displace and will be unable to displace for the foreseeable future so many things about dealing with others that come naturally to people. So what you see when technology gets deployed from the employee perspective, very often, a lot of the parts of their work that they didn't really like that much to begin with. In the old days, we'd call them dirty, dark, dangerous, but I'm going to add a fourth D, which is just plain dull,
Yeah.
can get automated away. And the human complementing the capability of the technology makes for a more productive job, and a more productive job allows employers to pay more. Now, in a lot of job classifications, because the company is that the operation is more productive, unless you have some very considerable growth in demand for whatever the good or service is, that does lead to a net reduction in headcount. So there are many variables in this equation, but we're not coming up on a world where robots are going to do everything and people are going to have to find something else to do. I think that linking to what you said earlier about younger workers, they turn over at a higher rate because they want to be learning about those cutting edge technologies. One last thing I'll say about workers across the salary spectrum, we surveyed them in 14 countries, and of all the countries, the country that had a workforce that felt most personal responsibility for being ready for what the future held and for acquiring new skills was the U.S. There's a lot of self-efficacy here, a lot of desire by people to know what they need to do to be future ready. The problem is they often don't know what to do, and they don't have the time and financial resources to pursue it when they do.
So super quick, I want to say thank you to Steve King and Cliff Watkin for being on today, and then really generous comments. So thank you. Um, this might be a little tactical, but I think it's just so pervasive that it's worth talking about. Do you mind just kind of chiming in on applicant tracking systems
Mhm.
and that level of technology that's kind of pitting employer against candidate?
Mhm. Well, I've got an extensive paper on this called Hidden Workers, Untapped Talent. And what that explores, Bob, is that applicant tracking systems, or ATS systems, which are basically deployed by every large company that you can think of, they're as smart as the as the way they're deployed. And all of them have the opportunity for employers to set uh, filters up that are based on the employer's description of the type of candidate they're looking for. So there will be variables like years of experience or a college degree or the lack of a criminal record. And there are many of these variables that an employer can express either an absolute filter, um, use it as a filter, i.e., criminal conviction exclude from consideration, just a 1-0 outcome,
Mhm.
and others to rank candidates. And it's always important when we think about hiring to remember that hiring is a relative phenomena. It's do I've got Joe and I've got Bob as a candidate. Which one do I prefer, as opposed to is Bob or is Joe a good worker?
Mhm.
And the rankings of employees become quite important. So, for example, to pick a very important one, about 50% of the so-called middle skills jobs in the US, middle skills job is something that requires something less than a college degree, but more than a high school diploma. So might be a certificate or training or a associate's degree. Um, will filter candidates out that have a gap of 6 months or more at any point in their resume. Now we can think about that through the lens. Why would that make sense to an employer? Maybe that person doesn't have a lot of self-efficacy. Maybe that doesn't sound like that person had former colleagues who are standing in line to hire them when they became available. Could be a worry about skills or atrophying. But 6 months gap isn't all that much. If you have a problem pregnancy, or one of your parents is dying, or your military spouse, and you transferred from 29 Palms to Camp Lejeune, 6 months can go by in a hurry. But all of a sudden, 50% of jobs that you might be qualified for are no longer going to look at you, and that raises the odds that 6 months becomes 8 months, and the 8 months becomes 12 months, and then all of a sudden you might be having skills atrophy. So ATS has also used what's called natural language processing to essentially read the job description and look for matches between the job description and the applicant's submission, whether
Yeah.
it's their job history or what they wrote. Well, in a lot of jobs, job descriptions aren't really fully updated. People just add stuff to them.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, that natural language processing might be looking for things you really emphasized in 1997 and doesn't really explain the success of a current incumbent worker in the position. But the ATS system isn't making judgments; it's doing what you told you to do. And what we found here is that the use of these ATS systems has basically marginalized almost 30 million candidates in the United States and artificially forecloses consideration on lots of applicants who would be otherwise qualified. And a perverse thing is companies admit it. 95% of companies say we know the way we go about this excludes qualified candidates.
So maybe that gets back to an earlier question. Then what is preventing them? What is the obstacle to get past something that they recognize
Yeah.
is a problem in a talent poor market?
Well, the first barrier is the way they think about their objective function. Recruiting and recruiting people in companies are almost always evaluated on two variables: how long did it take to fill the job, and how much did it cost to fill the
Yeah.
job?
Yeah.
And that creates an insidious logic where what I want to do is go to find somebody who is doing this job already somewhere else, because I want to make sure they're fully qualified, and it's easiest to find them, so it's quicker, so it's less expensive. Um, Also, companies minimize expense by minimizing the number of candidates they actively consider. So let's think about a group of people called the applicants, and then people drawn from that pool as legitimate candidates by the company, leaving behind a lot of applicants. Very often, if you have more than a couple of hundred job applicants, the average number of people who would actually get interviewed for the job is 5.
Mm.
So if you imagine there's a pool of 250 candidates and I'm going to put a floor under number 5, boy, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are not missing by much in all probability. And there may be somebody down you've ranked, you excluded for something like a criminal conviction 30 years ago or the lack of a bachelor's degree, but they've been working in the industry for 30 years. That would have been a great fit. You just never considered them because you had that 1-0 in out
Yes.
toggle in your ATS system. So in fact, it's both the interaction of the technology and the process and the process metrics inside the company that actually creates an artificial shortage. I mean, usually you have to rely on the federal government to come up with some brainstorm to create an artificial shortage. But in this case, employers are doing it to themselves.
The market figured it out. So let's stitch a couple ideas together here real quick, if you don't mind. One is with ATSs, as you say, they're only as smart as the programming that goes into them, and that could be highly flawed. And it has a very much a bias for you've been doing these hard skills for some period of time. You're easy to find, cheap to find. So there's that. Second thing is, read a fascinating article by somebody on CEOs and how the kind of the changing criteria for CEOs is moving from hard skills to more social skills, or what we might even more broadly think of as like softer skills. And tongue in cheek, the author is Professor Fuller, and it's in Harvard Business Review today. And then just sort of well, maybe that's it. I mean, like the role of attributes, qualities, creativity, perception, works well with others. Here's a unifying force, imagination, innovation, the things that computers don't do well.
Exactly.
Yeah. How this is a passion point for me. So I want to let you riff on this for a second, but how that can be more important, or at least given equal due or its proper due, versus, oh, you've been doing cost accounting for 12 years at a Fortune 500, therefore you're a better fit, blah, blah, blah. You understand the question.
Yep. Well, as technology, as we mentioned earlier, begins to take on more of the routine work in both cognitive and non-cognitive fields, what's left? What's left are the human skills. And it's very hard for AI to deal with the highly imperfect, unpredictable um, entities known as human beings. And what we see in uh, uh, wage work as opposed to C-suite work is that over time, jobs that have a higher quotient of social skills as part of the skill set have been gaining market share across the economy as more routine works get automated away, and the rate of pay increase in social skill heavy jobs is higher than average. What we did with C-suite executives, looking at 5 different job titles: CEO, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Information Officer, and Chief Human Resources Officer. So we looked at 20 years of data about what companies are putting in the dossiers they provide to executive search, sometimes called headhunter companies. What are they looking for? And over time, what that showed is that the degree to which social skills were prominent and listed as important relative to other skills like kind of business and financial management skills was growing markedly. So that over a 20-year period, what boards and incumbent executives at large companies were looking for was shifting away from the hard skills of management toward the ability to manage constituencies, the ability to align people, whether that's your direct reports or all up and down your organization's pyramid, to be mission focused, to have the right values, to have the right company culture. What would be called by a lot of scholars having a theory of the mind, having the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes
Empathy.
and see how they imagine how they see the situation and respond effectively based on that insight.
Yeah.
So human skills are continuing to gain share, and they're going to be very important to the future of work. And that does cause a question, which is we're pretty good at training people up on hard skills. We're not very good at training people up on soft skills. A lot of those are developed in your house, visiting your grandfolks, in your place of worship, in your neighborhood. A lot of the very interesting work that my colleague at Harvard, Rush Chetty, has done about the impact of geography on human development, I think is going to really play into this issue going forward.
Well, I'm just very pleased and encouraged to know that thought leaders like you and your colleagues are bringing the data forward that says these aren't soft skills, or maybe worse, less important skills. They're actually the more important skill.
Absolutely.
That's fine. You're a CFO. Yes, you need to know your craft, but that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story.
Absolutely.
Really quick, I want to call out a question here. This is a little specific, but it's been in the news a lot. Dave Poisson's asking, I'd love to know your thoughts on salary transparency as it relates to the future of work. Do you think we'll see open salary conversations amongst employees in the workplace, and then salary ranges more frequently be included in job postings?
This is a really fascinating question because it's not salary is the equivalent of your grade point average in a lot of people's mind, and not everyone's curious about everyone else's grade point average, but don't want to tell them their own. Sometimes we make a joke about our class at Harvard Business School that about 10-15% of our students get formal honors, but another 80% claim to be in the top 20% of the class. So I think that we're going to see decisions on transparency made more broadly by companies, and that this is going to be a choice of policy, but also of curating culture, and so that we will over time see a gradual, but I think slow, increase in informal mechanisms for transparency. If you get on Slack channels, or you get in Fishbowl, or in the Vault, or other platforms for people to share data about companies, you'll see a lot of anonymous data posted. But I'm really talking about as part of the way we do things around here in our company, discussing those things. I think there will be more transparency, particularly in white collar jobs, on income levels. And I think there will be also more movement in some types of job classifications to talk about what a salary trajectory looks like beyond the current position, in order to attract the consideration of these people who are turning over. One last thing I just want to throw out: the average life of a new software program being deployed in a company right now is about 2.5 years. So what paying for hard skills, particularly in a digital era, makes less and less sense. I mean, paying for soft skills and also the ability to learn,
yes,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, we were talking last week about learning agility is really the competitive advantage.
Yes.
Right. And your sort of secret weapon for job security. I want to be really cognizant of the time, Joe. I could talk to you for another 2 hours easily, because we barely scratched the surface on some stuff. First of all, Kelsey, just to acknowledge her comment, as someone currently applying for opportunities, it does feel like you have to battle through an ATS. I mean, the ATS's job is to say no as quickly as possible to as many as possible, right? And again, that's sort of that, use your word, insidious thing that's been built into the system. The average job application, I think you quoted the number a minute ago, 250. If they're trying to curate it to 5, well, then its goal is to say no as quickly as possible to as many as possible to get to 5. So, Kelsey, I hear you, and there's it's why being dependent on just online job postings is probably not a winning job strategy, because what's 1 over 250, that's probably not a great win rate. And when you know that the ATSs have these sort of built-in um, negative biases, it just makes it challenging. So with all that said, to kind of put a bow on this, Joe, what are maybe, I don't want to contrive a number, but 1, 2, 3 sort of things you would want to leave the audience with, whether you're an employer or a worker or a policymaker, I guess, for that matter?
Well, for an employer, it's that you need to really be applying supply chain management principles to the way you recruit. That the understanding who the good sources of workers who've been productive, where they came from, what their attributes were, working with skills providers, usually going to be educational institutions, to give them feedback about what's good and bad about the product they're providing you, a worker,
Mm-hmm.
working it, working with them on your future plans. We keep getting the same ugly surprises, like we wake up and all of a sudden we have explosive growth and the need for cybersecurity technicians. No one was saying that to colleges and universities 5 years ago, even though the trend lines were apparent. It's as if they're supposed to get that by osmosis. I think a couple of other quick things for employers. Your current frontline lower wage staff is a great resource pool. You can be deciding to make investments in upskilling someone based on a job personnel file, not on an interview and resume. And it's more diverse than your workforce. So if you're looking for diverse talent, look inside the four walls of your own enterprise. For workers, it's that you have to know that ATS contraption is between you and work. You have to be very uh, steely eyed about using the language it uses. If you're not getting interviews, look on LinkedIn, look at the job postings. What is it? Have a hypothesis as to why you are being excluded and do something to remedy that.
Yeah.
And for policymakers, it's unfortunately, policy tends to pour more concrete on standard business processes, because then uh, that's what you can regulate, and that's what causes there to be some scandal or some lawsuit or something that causes legislators to decide to get interested in something. Policymakers, they need to understand a couple of things. The first is that roughly 60% of today's 18-year-olds will never get a 4-year degree, and that we have to create better pathways for earning and learning for those people that are not going to follow the stereotypical American dream as we describe it. That means eliminating barriers to compensated work-based learning, particularly for teenagers. And I'm not talking about scooping ice cream. That's fine. It builds up your forearms, but I'm talking about things like paid apprenticeship. Apprentice is a loaded word because it's a specific term of art in the United States, but things like that. We have to recognize that people are going to need access to resources for um, adding new skills. That means having things like lifetime Pell Grants, and
Mm.
changing the way we have funding out of what's called the Higher Education Act, which is very restricted, basically along the logic of a 4-year college model, and needs to be completely overhauled. Something called Title IV of the Higher Education Act. We also the government should spend a lot of time on improving the quality and accessibility of information. In some states, if someone went to school in state and is employed in the state, you can see all the way through. What did they study? Where do they study? Whether it's elementary school, a high school, a state university, and what are they making? You
Wow.
could configure the IRS data to do that, and things like that. Um, Things like making sure that state owned universities have access to data like burning glass data, which tells you what jobs are being sought locally and what skills are required. We need to have evaluative metrics for higher education programs. Once again, we keep getting these ugly surprises. Bob, we've got 4-year colleges in the United States whose 6-year graduation rate is 8%.
Wow.
So the average graduation rate after 6 years across all 4 institutions is 54%. The 2-year graduation rate the 3-year graduation rate for an associate's program, which are almost always 2 years, so 50% premium, is 31%. Now, the 4-year completion rate at Harvard College, where I went to college, is 97%. But I'm not going to name and shame, but there is a 4-year accredited institution where you can use your federal loan, so it's 8%. Someone going to that school needs to know that. Someone going to that school needs to know whether, if I take this, have other people who've taken this pharmacy tech program at the community college, are they now employed as pharmacy techs, and what are they making? So we need the government to be way better off trying to make the market function better as opposed to drive specific outcomes. And that's allowed new types of working relationships, provide better liquidity to the system and better information to the system.
Yeah, information transparency is a beautiful thing.
It sure is.
Then market dynamics will do what they're good at doing. If people want to learn more about the project, Joe, or access the podcast, what's the best way to do that?
So we have a project website. The project is called Managing the Future of Work. You can see the URL is on the screen. But if you just Google Joe Fuller, Harvard Business School, Managing the Future of Work, it's on the front page. There are a couple of or 3 advertisements ahead of us, but and one aggravatingly from MIT for exec education program. But when you can sign on there, everything we've talked about, all the publications can be downloaded from that site. All the podcasts are there and it's searchable. So if they're looking for a person or a topic, you should be able to find it. And you can sign up for a newsletter there, which will keep you up to date on what we're doing.
Wonderful. Joe, this is better than good, as a friend of mine says. So thank you so much. We'll be doing a little bit of a recap on this for folks on LinkedIn tomorrow. This will be available as a podcast a little bit later on today. But mostly, I just want to say thank you. Your expertise on the topic, the holistic understanding that you bring to this, and not just sort of problem identification, but very specific solutions, I know are much appreciated. And so again, I just thank you for sharing that expertise with me and with our audience today.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that generous critique. It was a pleasure being with you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.